about what kinds of things you might be able to measure. One of the things that we're laying the groundwork for today is really starting to tell our story and really figuring out if what we're doing is effective, if we can share the work that volunteers are doing within our organization and within our community to really talk about how volunteers help us move our missions forward. So one of the sections that we will talk about today is, why does this matter? What can we hope to accomplish, or what kinds of questions could we be asking ourselves to evaluate our volunteer engagement programs, to evaluate the effectiveness of our organization? And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how does it matter to volunteers? So I think sometimes we get busy, we just get into our busy season, or even our slow season feels like our busy season, and we don't necessarily take a step back and ask some of those questions of not just how effective is our program, but how valued do our volunteers feel? How effective do our volunteers, how effective are they in our program? So we'll talk about how you can find some of this information and how you can talk to your volunteers about this. So we may have one perspective running our programs or not being a volunteer within our organization, but volunteers may have another perspective. We'll also talk today about how to engage volunteers in this activity. Again, if you've been with us before, we talked a lot about how we don't have to do this all by ourselves. A lot of times we can look to volunteers as leaders within our volunteer engagement program. And then, as I talked about, this is really about telling that story, setting that stage, figuring out what that compelling information is that we have to share, and then sharing it, and not tweeting. So certainly social media. Again, if you've joined us for other webinars, we talk about how valuable it can be to share that kind of information in those little bite-sized stories with our online communities. All right. So what kind of information is out there? And we can talk about quantitative versus qualitative. And quantitative is often the easiest, right? When we talk about measuring what our volunteer program does, giving out our volunteer awards or recognizing volunteers, oftentimes it's how many hours they've been with us, how many years they've been with us, how many hours they've volunteered with us. The easy things to count: trees planted, meals served. So when we talk about quantitative, that's usually a number, something that can be counted. But we oftentimes leave out the qualitative because it can be harder to measure. You can't put it in a spreadsheet and use a little sum tool to come up with the answer. It is more descriptive, but it's certainly things that can be observed, but not counted or measured. So one of the things that one of the examples I like to use is if I say, I have 7 red apples. 7 is that quantitative, right? I can count the number 7, but red would be qualitative, or maybe they're crunchy, or they're shiny, or whatever that is. Those are the qualitative kinds of things. So when we talk about that with our programs, and we talk about that with our volunteers, we might talk about sort of an increase in happiness or an increase in well-being for our clients when the friendly visitors come to read to them in their hospital rooms, or that the nursing home residents feel a little bit more of a brighter outlook on life, or they feel more content when they have a garden that is pretty and full of flowers. So again, we start looking at some of those qualitative, again, not just necessarily working with our clients, but how do our volunteers feel at the end of a shift? Do they feel satisfied? Do they feel like they've made a difference? Are they skilled volunteers? Are you bringing in skilled volunteers to work in your program? So what are some of those qualitative, descriptive kinds of things you might be able to evaluate or look at or compile when we start talking about our volunteering into a spreadsheet? But when we start telling stories, it's the qualitative that's going to make a difference. So as we go in today, we're going to talk about both of these kinds of information, as well as how we might be able to describe the work that volunteers are doing, as well as to describe how the volunteers feel about the work that they're doing, and then the impact on the community. So again, depending upon what your program looks like, you may also have clients in this formula or in this equation where they're also able to provide feedback or that they are receiving the benefits of those volunteers. And that's probably a qualitative evaluation as well. All right, so I mentioned the usual stuff, and these are the kinds of things that are really easy, right? And those sort of the historical things that we've done. And when we start thinking differently about evaluating our program and start looking at some of those things that are not quantitative but are in fact qualitative, talk about the quality of volunteer engagement or the quality of the programs delivered, we'll start talking a little bit about how to start telling those stories. And the numbers are important, particularly if you are doing grants or have to fill out reports back to your city or to your jurisdiction. They want to know the numbers, but the numbers only tell part of the story. So certainly the usual things, right? We've talked about many of these: number of volunteers that you have, the number of hours a volunteer gives, and that estimated dollar value. Oh, thank you, Matt. Sorry about that. I didn't realize I was on pause. All right. So the goodness, it's just been one of those days. Certainly that dollar value by the independent sector, I think it's up to almost $22 an hour now, and that's an easy number, right? You plug it into that equation, and it gives you X number of hours donated by each volunteer, and that has an estimated dollar value, and then that equals an amount of money that might be equal to a paid staff person. Again, it's easy to count, but it's not always a really good representation of what we're doing. And then when we start talking about what volunteers do, again, how many trees planted, how many meals served, how many animals adopted, whatever those are, again, easy numbers to count, but what's the value of finding a pet and bringing a pet into a family? What's the value of making sure that a family has food for this weekend? What's the value of planting a tree that's going to make a park a much more inviting space for your community? So that's harder when we start looking at some of those long-term impacts. Money donated, you may have volunteers that are also donating to your program. And then a lot of times we look at what that cost is per volunteer, or cost of the volunteer program versus that magic number of volunteer hours times sort of an average amount. And that's not always a good way to evaluate whether your volunteers are effective or if they are actually engaged in your program, how satisfied they feel. So I'm going to start asking you to start thinking a little bit differently about what you might be able to ask or count or measure as we move forward today. All right. So it does start to get a little bit tricky, right? Because it is hard to figure out what's the value of a tree in a park. I'm going to point you to Tony Goodrow. Some of you may know him from Volunteer Squared, and he has put together this scarce resources model, sort of a return on investment for volunteers. And I'd encourage you, this will go out in the slides, Matt can also tweet it out. It's actually a really interesting model. You could start putting in sort of some costs and some volunteers and figuring out some of the actual, the value of some of the work that you're doing. And he does a really good job, I think, of you know, I don't want to spend too much time focusing on this. I think it's a good tool to go and visit and to play around with on your own and see what comes up. But one of the things that he points out is lots of times we set goals for our volunteer engagement program, and again, they're those quantitative goals, and so the answer is oftentimes, well, for example, last year you engaged 500 volunteers. For next year, I'd like your goal to be engaged 750 volunteers. Or last year, volunteers gave us 1,000 hours. This year, I'd like to see volunteers give us 2,000 hours. And so we oftentimes just think that bigger is better, and that's not always the case, particularly if that output or if the work that volunteers are doing is the same amount. So if you serve 10,000 meals last year with 1,000 volunteers, and you serve 10,000 meals next year with 2,000 volunteers, you've actually decreased the effectiveness of each one of those volunteers by half. So it can be a very eye-opening model to play around with. So I'd encourage you to go in there and think about it. I think it takes us in a good direction. I'm not sure it's, again, a perfect solution, just like with so many other things. It depends on your program, it depends on what you're doing, and then there's that actual value of the work. So as we start to look at, if you have a skills-based volunteer, or if you have a volunteer coming in doing something besides sort of entry-level work in your organization, nutrition, counseling, tutoring, animal care, that all comes out to a much higher actual value than that average from the independent sector. So that can get us a little bit closer to what we might actually be able to talk about. Again, this idea that if you had to pay for it, this is what the value would be of all the work that your volunteers are doing. But it's actually so much more than that, and that's where the storytelling piece comes in. Sometimes, again, if you have boxes to fill out on grant applications or reports to fill out back to our cities, we have to figure out what that value of donated time is. But when we start talking about the impact, that qualitative, what makes it different? What's our mission when we look back to our missions of our organizations or the mission of our volunteer engagement program and start looking at what difference do our volunteers make to our organization, to the community, to our clients? That's where that story lies, and that's where that qualitative part lies, and that's where you're going to start to get to some of these things that can help you move your program forward. There are a couple of good articles out there about health and volunteering. When we start talking about volunteers and what's in it for them, the impact of volunteering on your volunteers. I don't know, Matt, if you have, I think it's the United Health article.
I can tweet that out afterwards.
Okay, great. So there have been some studies and some reports on how volunteers are happier, volunteers live longer lives. So as we start looking at what we might be able to measure, don't forget that second half of that circle, if you will. You have that first part of that circle, that's what your volunteers are doing for your organization, what your volunteers are doing for your clients. But what's that sense of well-being or accomplishment that comes for your volunteers, that their ability to give back, that place in the community? If you have skills-based volunteers, what are your skills-based volunteers getting from this relationship that they have with you? Are they building their portfolio? Are they using 30 years of professional experience to help a cause they care about? What are those impacts? So we really want to start looking at both pieces as we move forward. And again, the further we get away from number of volunteers, hours per volunteer, numbers of sandwiches passed out, the more tricky it can be, but the more rewarding it can be. And when we start talking about telling our story, putting those pieces together, and sharing those stories, that's where we're going to really start talking about what's that impact, what's the impact of our organization, what's the impact of our volunteers, and how does it make a difference, not just to our clients and to our organization, but to the volunteers that we work with. All right, so hopefully we have an idea of why it does matter, that it can be very easy at the end of the year. You have to get it done. You just put some numbers in a spreadsheet and you send it out. But we can do so much better than that. When we start thinking about what kinds of questions we want to know answers to, or what kind of information might be persuasive to others, particularly when we start talking about becoming an advocate for volunteer engagement within our organization. So